Hello, everybody, and welcome to this latest UK and Changing Europe lunch hour, where we're looking at food, farming, and the future. I'm Jill Rutter. I'm a senior research fellow at UK and Changing Europe, and it's a real pleasure to be doing this today. So last month, it's April now, isn't it? In March, we published this report, Brexit and the State, that was looking at how far the UK had come in adapting to its post-Brexit responsibilities, opportunities, duties, burdens, whatever you like. And I think one of the things that many people would have thought of when we left the European Union was at least we could reform agricultural policy. After all, the UK had bridled for years and years and years about the common agricultural policy, and many farmers were thought to have voted for Brexit thinking that the future without the CAP would be a better one. So it's a brilliant time to take stock of where we are in food, farming support policy, food security, net zero, the whole range of issues. That's what we're going to range across for the next hour or so. So I am joined by a phenomenally excellent panel. First up, I have Carmen Hubbard. Carmen is a reader in agricultural economics and policy at Newcastle University. And I know from my time at DEFRA that Newcastle was a sort of go-to place for studies on what was going on in agriculture policy. Then from Trinity College Dublin, Department of Economics, Alan Matthews, who is a professor of European agricultural policy, to bring in that EU angle, because many of the challenges confronting the UK are also challenging our former partners in the European Union. And last, but by absolutely no means least, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Minette, who will be known to many of you from her, very, very long stint, first as deputy president of the NFU, but then through all those tortured Brexit years, a very prominent spokesman for agriculture as president of the National Farmers Union. So just a reminder, we'll be taking questions on Slido. Please upvote, and there's already a bit of upvoting going on. Upvote a question that is more or less the question you would have asked. Obviously, it won't be quite as good as that, but then I'll be able to see what people want to have asked, or post your own questions, and we will get going, and we will be done by 2 o'clock, more or less, she said, more or less. I'm going to start with Carmen. Carmen, Michael Gove made some big promises about reforming the CAP when he became Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, probably about 5 or 6 Secretaries of State ago. There have been quite a lot of them since, in 2017, promising, payment for public goods, health and harmony, which always sounds to me like a brand of shampoo or something like that, in that new vision for how we would run agricultural policy. So how far have we got, and what are the big differences in how we now plan to support agriculture in England, but also in the other countries, because agriculture has, of course, devolved across the UK? Carmen.
Thank you. You probably will need to stop me, Jill, because I have lots of things to say about, and okay. I know I can speak forever.
We do want the other panelists to have a look in as well, Carmen.
Yeah, so exactly. Thank you. Thank you for the invite. I would like to start with saying that there has been some progress, particularly in England, but the progress has been slow. The main point I would like to make here is that we replaced the CAP actually with 4 policy frameworks. So I think this will be one of the big changes which really happened once Brexit took place. So we moved from a framework which was common for all countries to 4 agriculture policy frameworks, which are different. The other point which I would like to make is in relation to what you said regarding subsidies. Under the CAP, British farmers receive they benefited generously from all sorts of type of support, particularly in the form of direct payments, which supported the farm income. And these were the main debate. These were subject to the main debate regarding, your point made about Gov. So although the idea was that we would replace direct payments, we are in the phase of transition in in England, where they are phasing out. Or they will have to be phased out by 2028. But this is not necessarily the case in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, and in Wales, where farmers are still receiving direct payments in full, at least until 2024, 2025. And it's also, in Scotland, we don't really know what will really happen, because Scotland has really remained aligned with most of the CAP type support. So actually what Scotland did, just realign the EU legislation to the Scottish legislation. Of course, there are other things related to trade, but I'm not sure if you want me to talk about that.
We're going to get into trade a bit later on. So we've got some big reforms in England.
Yes.
Slower, maybe less reforms in Scotland and Wales.
Yeah, and in Northern Ireland.
And in Northern
Ireland, giving the political instability.
And in Northern Ireland. So it's always useful to remember we've got sort of 4 different systems of supporting agriculture. Minette, where do farmers think this is going? Are they happy at what this post-CAP future is looking like? Do they prefer the approach maybe of the Scottish or Welsh government? Are they worried about farm budgets going forward? We keep on hearing about the big pressures on public spending. And have we now sort of reached a sort of, a clear view of what the English scheme looks like? Because I think it's chopped and changed with every Secretary of State, as far as I can tell. But Minette, where's farming at the moment?
Oh, Jill, thank you. I mean, we've had so many iterations, and policy development, as we all know, is challenging to deliver. You think of all those fines that we've faced with a flawed IT system on delivery in the past. And of course, now we don't face, the UK government doesn't face the fines that it did, but that in itself is dangerous. And when you think it was only last June that we had major policy development with the unbundling of the options. So for the Rural Payments Agency, this is still a gargantuan challenge of, can they deliver now what is growing demand with the uplift in the payment rates? Can they deliver on a time schedule? Who knows? We'll have to watch that. So the huge uncertainty for farmers. I know many that I've spoken to are pleased at the uplift. Of course, now we've got the capping on part of it. So you can't put a whole farm into environmental crops, which you could. So another change there. But what the new system doesn't do is allow us to manage our risk. And when you've had the wettest winter on record that we've had just now, losing the direct payment means there is no way of managing our risk. There is no payment for storing water. We've got obviously the flood recovery scheme that's come out, but that's proving to be challenging because a lot of farmers that have been badly impacted haven't been able to access it. Government is again making changes. So I think farmers still feel that this is a very nerve-wracking road. Don't forget, we de-linked last year in England. That's, to me, quite a frightening journey to 28 when you've de-linked and you're on a road that effectively is very, very uncertain. And don't forget, we are prioritising funding environmental crops at the expense of food production. I've always believed this should be about food and the environment. There's no reason why we shouldn't be incentivising companion cropping, protein crops, but this is about less food production. So first of all, we need that impact assessment of what is this doing to our food security, especially coming up to a general election where hopefully we can have some clarity in the policy framework going forwards and agreement across the devolved nations.
So Minette, I'm just going to get you to explain to non-expert audiences, what do you mean by delinking? What's the difference for a farmer between bundled and unbundled payments? And how different is this from the sort of original scheme? Because DEFRA has been doing quite a lot of co-design, even at your retirement party, Minette. There was, a tribute paid to the lead DEFRA official on this, because DEFRA has been doing quite a lot. I think there were some positive words about DEFRA's efforts to try and design this new scheme with farmers, but it does seem that farmers are afflicted by quite a lot of chopping and changing and uncertainty. But is the scheme now radically different from the one that was originally envisaged, or not different enough, maybe?
Well, don't forget that this policy was all developed under the Johnson administration, and there were many flaws with that. And Health and Harmony was back in the day, pre-COVID, pre-war in Ukraine. Our world feels really different. So it was all about public monies for public goods. Initially, they bundled all the options. We were saying from day one, unbundle them so individual farms can pull down what suits their farm. Eventually that happened, but it didn't happen until last June. So the point I'm trying to make is, if you're delivering all of this, you really needed to have piloted your delivery with your policy development. That again, DEFRA refused to do. So they've never piloted delivery, which is why it's still uncertain as to whether it can be. And obviously the Sunak government is a very different one to the Johnson government. And in between, don't forget, we had Liz Truss. Well, Liz Truss at one moment in time is going to rip up the whole of the Elm scheme and start again. So you've had chopping and changing of policies on this journey. And it's why we get to this point in 2024 where we still have a lot of uncertainty about what the options are and what the plans are for what I would call the more intensive sectors. Horticulture, we've been talking about this horticultural revolution. We still have the same legacy PO structure that we had in the EU. It's got a budget of sort of 40 million. I would say that needs to be substantially enlarged so that pigs, poultry, both broilers and eggs, and the horticultural sector has a much bigger, pie effectively to be carved out of this money. But there's so little certainty because of all those changes with three very, very different governments. I know all Conservative, but they couldn't have been more different. So what was promised was a lot less bureaucracy, a lot less complexity. And don't forget, this was going to be much better than the CAP. It shows every sign at the moment of being much more bureaucratic. I'm engaging my farm, a grassland farm, in the SFI. We're just about to start our SAM3 seed application. You've got to, this is a really key point, Jill. It's all based on the income foregone model, which means you have to do things, you have to do actions before you get paid for it. So the farmer, don't forget, cash flow is really tight after this winter. The farmer's got to go out, make those investments in seed. Capital grants obviously available for countryside stewardship, but the farmer has got to make those investments first before they can claim anything back. So it's a major change from what we had before.
Okay, major change. Alan, what's confronting farmers in Europe? Have there been major changes to the CAP since we left? How different is it from the sort of schemes that we're envisaging in England, or indeed the sort of legacy schemes that Carmen was saying we still see in the other parts of the UK?
Well, it's very interesting to listen to what has been happening in the UK over the past 3 years, because we've also had a bit of a roller coaster ride within the European Union. Along two channels, I guess, Jill. One is, as you say, we had a reform of the CAP in 2021, came into force at the beginning of last year, 2023, which did attempt to bring about a sort of greater environmental and climate ambition. And I would see that in two ways. So first of all, a significant portion of the budget was repurposed to target those objectives. So the agri-environment and climate objective money went from about 16% of the CAP budget to double that to about 32% at the moment. And then in addition, there was some additional requirements on EU farmers who are in receipt of CAP payments in terms of what we call this, what you will remember as the conditionality or the cross-compliance obligations. So that was the CAP. And then we also had, of course, the new commission, which came into office at the end of 2019, proposed this Green Deal, which had really important implications to try to address some of the environmental challenges also within agriculture and land use. So you had this farm to fork strategy, you had the biodiversity strategy, and that led to a series of legislative initiatives, which in some respects were quite successful, particularly on the climate side. I think the EU got most of its proposed climate legislation implemented. But when it came to the more farm-related, agriculture-related initiatives on pesticides, for example, on nature restoration, even on soil health, we've seen a bit of a pushback in the light of some of the changing circumstances that Minette has identified, the COVID pandemic, obviously rising concerns around food security, whether justified or not, in terms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the world market implications of that. So yes, a bit of a roller coaster ride also in the European Union, and we have seen some pushback. You've seen the farmer protests in many European countries. Interestingly, often triggered by very specific national circumstances, very different from country to country. So farmers in the Central European countries worried about imports of grain from Ukraine, farmers in Spain worried about water shortage issues, farmers in France, the prices paid by supermarkets. In Germany, it was a government proposal to raise the taxation on diesel used by farmers. So even though these have been, in a sense, very specific, they have converged into a series of concerns. We can come back to them later to discuss some of them to do with trade that Carmen has raised. But it's going to be really interesting to see whether that trajectory that was established 3 years ago to sort of shift agricultural support more in the direction of addressing some of the really challenging environmental and climate objectives, whether that will continue after the European elections in June of this year.
That's very interesting. And has the budget gone up for the CAP, or has it sort of gone down? Because the UK used to always be advocating sort of, reining in spending on agriculture, which took up a disproportionate share of the European budget. But is it pretty much the same as it always was over this 7-year period?
Yes, that is the case, Jill. There really hasn't been any change in the nominal amount devoted to agriculture in the overall EU budget. So I guess, given the inflation of the last 2 or 3 years, that in real terms, the value of those payments has dropped somewhat. And that is an issue, because I think everybody recognizes that there are at least transitional costs in this green transition. And of course, we probably could repurpose more of the CAP budget. We still have a situation where a lot of the CAP payments go to larger farms, ostensibly for income support. But, are these farms really in need of income support? Could that money not be actually used more effectively to target some of these challenges that farmers are facing? But even repurposing the existing budget may not be sufficient. And that's going to be a huge challenge when we negotiate the next multi-annual financial framework in Europe, because we know the huge demands there are on the EU budget, whether it's for industrial competitiveness, whether it's for defense spending and so on. So whether the CAP will be able to get an increase in its budget, again, is an open question.
And I'm intrigued, is anyone in Europe looking at the UK, the England reforms of agriculture spending to say, is that a model for us for the future, sort of?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that the last CAP reform was moving in the direction that I think, traditional UK policy would have been very pleased with. So, there has been some convergence, but it's clear that at least until now, there has been no appetite to go the whole way that England in the UK has gone with the delinking and the proposed total elimination of direct area-based payments. That certainly has not been on the agenda. Yeah.
No. Okay. So, Carmen, you hinted at a bunch of issues around trade, and obviously taking back control of trade policy, setting up an independent UK trade policy done at UK level. Its reserve power was one of the big prizes from Brexit. So how's the UK been approaching agriculture? Is usually quite a big battleground in trade deals. So I'm going to bring all of you in about approaches to trade policy. We've seen deals with Australia, New Zealand, UK accession to CPTPP. So where's that left British food and farming?
Thank you. Just before that, can I just clarify about the link for the audience?
Yeah.
I know Minette will give a comprehensive answer, but I just want to, as an academic, I just want to say that the link was really related to direct payments and means that they will not be linked to farmland. So they would not give them money for the area which will be farmed, and it will be just, you know. So, but these were really related to direct payments in England. Going back to trade, what really happened at the beginning, what we know is that agriculture is a devolved policy, trade is not a devolved policy. So trade is led by Westminster. What we initially did, we replaced the former EU common external tariff with the UK global tariffs. So this means that from a level of protection for the UK market, there were not big changes there, because what we really did, we just changed the exchange rate. Instead of euro, we use pound, and we went with the same tariffs. So from a level of protection with countries with which the EU or the UK didn't have a deal, you know, the tariffs remain the same. The novelty is that we have indeed signed up new trade deals with Australia and New Zealand. And if we look at the impact so far, I would say the impact it's rather modest. Probably the main impact will be felt if we are going to continue trade deals with, particularly with US, with bigger players, with US and with Mercosur. I think there are other changes, some things which are probably important to say in relation to trade with the European Union is that although we assume that this was free trade between the UK and the EU, there were some additional costs which they were related to paperwork, to checks at the borders. What I think it was also interesting is the fact that whereas the UK exports were subject to this control, we did not really impose the same checks on imports until January 2024. And that is because our targeting operating model didn't really work, and because the UK wanted to digitalize the system and wanted to make working very, very, very well. But I would say this is still work in progress. I think I will.
No, that's
here because the others may want to add something.
Yes, Minette, we have a very excellent Brexit Witness Archive interview with you, where you express worries about the approach that the UK government's taking to trade policy from the perspective of the farming sector. And we also have one with George Eustice, one of the many former Secretaries of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, but rather longer serving one, who makes it clear that he had a lot of reservations about the approach being taken from the Department of International Trade under Liz Truss about the way they were approaching trade deals. So if we turn first to the sort of external, before we get to what it's like trying to do business with the EU for farming nowadays, what do you think about the approach the UK government's taken to trade policy from a perspective of farming and food security, maybe?
Jill, I can only say it's been a nightmare. It's a better nightmare now than it was. But, back in the day with the Johnson government, not only were we legislating hand over fist on environmental protection and animal welfare here, but we were striking trade deals and putting none of that in place for the food that would be coming into this country. So it's right, Carmen's right to say that there isn't much impact yet from Australia or New Zealand, but there could be. And what the Johnson team gave away was the ability to do anything about it going forwards. We will not have any of the safeguard measures in place. So if something does go wrong, and we're, for instance, with beef, very easy to upset carcass balance, we wanted to keep frozen and bone in. So the Australians had to manage their own carcass so that we didn't displace Irish beef, something that Liz Truss was very fond of talking about. So we gave away so much to those countries. And then, of course, and the interesting one here is Canada, whereby the UK government, Rishi Sunak, taking a different approach to Liz Truss, they walked away from the enhanced trading relationship with the Canadians. That was all over hormone-treated beef. You heard last week Boris Johnson saying ridiculous that the government walked away. Well, they had to. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, put in writing May last year, not now, not ever will we import hormone-treated beef or chlorine-washed chicken. The Canadians have been playing hardball on this all along. And Liz Truss, indeed, would have fully liberalised with the Trans-Pacific deal, the CPTPP. So we would have had a fully liberalised deal. We would have already got hormone-treated beef here. Now, it's safe to eat. Of course it's safe, scientifically safe. But what we've been battling with is the whole business of food values. And this is why, actually, the last thing I did when I left the NFU was write a joint letter with WWF to all party leaders saying, could they please introduce the core standards as recommended by the Trade Agriculture Commission, which would mean our negotiators would have a clear mandate with other countries to say, you know, this is our offer, and these are our red lines, and this is what we're asking for on animal welfare and environmental protection. That's not food safety. That's about the values. We still don't have an answer, I might add, from Labour on this subject of international trade, or the Liberal Democrats. And it's such, as you know better than anyone, it's such a complex subject. There's a real danger, I think, that we go into this election without proper commitment on where the UK stands on these really important food values. We were the first country in the world to legislate on animal welfare, and we should be proud of it, and we should be continuing to lead on it.
So, Alan, what's the EU been doing in the meantime on its trade deals? I mean, the UK used to always say, well, we couldn't do trade deals with places. They didn't, you know, protectionist French protecting their agriculture. Now we're forced to make some of those trade-offs and decisions ourselves. And obviously that's quite politically contentious. The EU's, I think, done a deal with New Zealand. Can't remember whether it's actually done a deal with Australia or not. It's got a deal with Canada. Which was the one we'd rolled over, which has now hit the buffers. So what's the EU thinking about agriculture? Has it changed its approach to agriculture and its trade deals, or has it got very different deals in, say, the New Zealand agreement to the one that the UK struck?
Well, trade is equally controversial in the EU as it seems to be in the UK. And I would highlight two issues, Jill. One is the issue of environmental standards in trade in general. So in other words, EU farmers would argue that they are being asked to meet higher environmental standards that imports coming into the EU are not required to meet, and that in a sense that's unfair competition. And they're joined in that by the environmental NGOs who argue that if, as a result of losing competitiveness, consumers tend to purchase more imports, then that's simply exporting the environmental problem out of Europe, but it doesn't actually diminish it. And in fact, in some cases, if European producers are more efficient, it actually could exacerbate the global issue. So that issue is focused very much on what we call mirror clauses. It is indeed a French initiative, and we've seen some examples of the introduction of these so-called mirror clauses. In other words, requiring imports to meet the same standards as EU producers must meet. We've seen that, for example, introduced for antimicrobials. We've seen it introduced for neonicotinoid pesticides. So on a case-by-case basis, you do see some environmental protectionism, if you want to put it like that. And then the other issue, which I think you're specifically focusing on, is the role of sustainability chapters in our free trade agreements. And this is also a source of contention, because In the past, these were included. They were kind of best endeavor initiatives. So basically, the two parties agreed that they would cooperate and that they would try to improve their sustainability interventions. But there was no comeback if you didn't do that. So what the EU is now insisting on is introducing sanctions. So in other words, if you don't maintain, for example, your commitment under the Paris Agreement, if you don't maintain your commitment under the Global Biodiversity Framework, you may actually suffer the loss of those trade concessions that you've negotiated so hard for. And of course, that is facing pushback from our trade partners. So we see the Mercosur agreement held up because of disagreements on these sustainability clauses. We see the free trade agreement with India also held up. We did succeed with the free trade agreement with New Zealand, as you rightly pointed out. That's because we have very similar standards with New Zealand, and there was never really any likelihood that we would be imposing sanctions on each other, because of breaches in sustainability issues. But that's different, obviously, with other countries. So yes, trade issues are very much front and center of some of the controversies. And just a final comment on it. It clearly, part of the farm protests that we have seen have reflected the autonomous trade measures that the EU introduced, to assist Ukraine, and it's really fighting for its life and survival at the present time. But that those free trade measures have obviously also had, some adverse impacts, particularly on agricultural markets in the neighbouring countries, and we've seen some pushback against that as well.
And Alan, we've got a question about the potential impact of enlargement if the EU enlarges on agriculture policy and then through to the UK market. Is that Ukraine argument about grain, is that a sort of precursor of other discussions, or is Ukraine so disproportionate compared to other candidate countries that actually it's not going to be a big problem with some of the Western Balkans if they get near EU membership?
Well, clearly there are huge disparities in size between Ukraine and the other, I'll say 8 candidate countries, because Turkey, it is a candidate country, but I don't see that as moving anywhere quickly in the near future. So there is this huge disparity. A lot of the concern is, what would happen if we were to extend the current system of capped direct payments that Carmen has explained, linked to area, if we were to extend that to Ukrainian agriculture, because it is clearly a very large agricultural producer. In my view, I don't think that's the crucial issue. I think the crucial issue is simply the competitiveness of Ukrainian agriculture. And that's already been demonstrated, given that we have now given free access with some safeguards introduced in the most recent revision of those trade measures with Ukraine, but basically free access. And we do see how competitive Ukrainian agriculture will be. Now, it's clear that they don't yet meet all of the environmental standards that European farmers must meet. So they would have to be introduced as part of an accession process, of course. But everything that I read about Ukraine suggests that that's not really going to dent its competitiveness. It is a hugely competitive producer of wheat and sunflower and other commodities.
Minette, we've got quite a few questions coming in about the sort of impact on the UK of its ability, competing with the EU. Questions about, one person suggesting that the UK farming industry is having to compete with heavily subsidized EU farming. Another comment about the impact of labour shortages. Minette disappeared. No, Minette's not got a photograph anymore.
Can I just add a bit, maybe on labor shortage, and also maybe, I know Minette disappeared, I would like she to come back, because as an agriculture economist, when people are talking about trade and trade being rather seen as a villain, it does disappoint. because trade has its role, and we have to think that it's not only about imports coming in, it's also we exporting as well. So if you impose a system to one country, the reaction will be immediately. So we always need to be careful about how we talk about the importance of trade in terms of imports and exports. And I'm surprised that Alan knows more about trade than I do. When you talk about the environmental standards and animal welfare and so on, I do think that in a way that it's a level of protection for which countries, rich countries like us, we can afford to do to support our farmers, as opposed to those who may not, and we know we are still, and who are also very dependent on their agriculture. So it's interesting how we talk about what we think is good for us, but what about others? And we know that the idea of replacing CAP with new policy was that it damaged the agriculture, it damaged the environment, it damaged our farmers, it damaged the rest of the world as well. I feel a little bit that probably, when it comes to trade and all these standards which are starting to imposing on all, it's a bit of a, it's something which comes from rich country, which can afford to do that. If you are rich, you can support, you can subsidize your farmers. If you are poor, you're actually taxing. And is that okay? Alan could say, I'm going to labor shortage. Labor shortage particularly important in this country, and we do know, we have seen this. After Brexit, the impact was almost immediate. It was immediate. It was an immediate impact on our sector, because processing, horticulture depends very much on both seasonal and permanent labor. And most of these people were actually coming from where? From Central and Eastern Europe. So labor shortage, particularly important. It has been addressed by these governments, allowing people, some visa for working here. And I think it was at the last summit, the Farm and Fork Summit, which our Prime Minister said, oh yes, we will, increase the number of visas so people could come here, and in 2024 we'll have about 45,000 people now coming. Labor shortage is important. Maybe Alan or Minette may like to add.
Yeah, Minette, sorry, we're just discussing how much harder it is as a farmer in the UK to do business post-Brexit. We were talking about labour shortages, some of the export controls that you face moving goods into the EU, which was a big market for UK food exports, one of our big export industries, and maybe cast that forward to what would you be looking to see on that in terms of future relationship with the EU that a future government might be looking to negotiate? We hear sometimes that Labour might be interested in negotiating an SPS, a sanitary and phytosanitary arrangement with the EU, and then I'll come on to Alan to see whether he thinks there'd be any EU interest on that side. So what would be your asks of a future government in terms of making life easier for farmers?
Well, Jill, firstly, huge apologies. My Wi-Fi dropping out there.
Don't worry. We'll battle that, even in central London. So,
I mean, I think the challenge is that friction equals cost, and we've still got quite a lot of friction. So our trading relationship with Europe is a very different one, and that's had major impact on many SMEs in this country, and food has not been left out of that, because it's a very, very different relationship. And of course, it's only recently that we've got a reciprocal relationship with the EU. They have not faced the full gamut of checks and inspections that our exporters have faced. And so it's not the relationship we had before. I think it's going to take time. Labour are talking about getting an SPS agreement. We know that the Commission has to date, and will continue to go slowly in this area. And, you know, that's well within their gift to do that. Why would they want to hurry anything? So I think that will take time. What will that mean with our relationship with the rest of the world? I mean, Labour and the Liberal Democrats are saying we want to have alignment with the European Union. The Conservatives have always talked about dynamic alignment, and that's always been slightly vague as to actually what that really means. And of course, you know, it is for 4 nations, 1 country, and therein has been quite a large challenge as well. So Labour talking about alignment, I think that would certainly help trade flows, but what does it mean for the rest of the world? And timescales. I can't see this happening quickly. I think yet again, the Commission will take their time, and we could well see the journey of another Parliament still discussing what the future relationship is of the UK with the EU. So bearing in mind, this all started back in 2016, we're now 2024, it's taking a very, very long time to resolve.
Alan, is there anything from the EU side that might move negotiating smoother border controls or something like that up the agenda? The UK, even though we seem to have delayed this month's checks because we're worried about the cost implications, but the UK is at last moving towards imposing, you know, more reciprocal border checks and stuff. Is that causing businesses in the EU to start lobbying for some sort of agreement to make that cross-channel border flow better than it has been since Brexit?
Well, I guess we haven't seen the pressures yet because, as has been explained, the UK hasn't actually imposed those controls to date. So we haven't really seen what additional costs they might involve. From what I can understand, the most of the focus on the UK side is particularly around veterinary alignment. And, you know, there are precedents. The European Union has a veterinary agreement. Even before the recent free trade agreement with New Zealand, we had a veterinary agreement which minimized the number of checks that were required on imports of New Zealand animal products into the Union. So you could see, you know, that could be a feasible way forward with the UK. I mean, I guess the issue really is that what we do in these mutual recognition agreement is that we recognize equivalence. So we don't require that the legislation be exactly the same in both countries, but we need to ensure that whatever the legislation is in the trading partner, that it attains the same safety objective as our own legislation in the EU. So in other words, we're not prepared to compromise on the objective, but we may well be prepared to accept that the way you do things is slightly different, but actually does give us the same outcome. The problem is that, you know, over time, the UK is going to gradually diverge in some of these standards. You've already introduced legislation, for example, which will allow new breeding techniques. We haven't done that yet in the European Union. So what happens when the UK tries to export a wheat variety which has been produced using these techniques, and you know, that's not yet recognized or requires a much more formal procedure for approval within the European Union. You know, we haven't really got to those kind of issues yet. So I do see quite a bumpy road ahead in terms of those alignment of standards.
Okay, bumpy on alignment of standards. I want to come to a different set of issues we've got lots and lots of people asking about, which is just more general resilience. I think Minette was talking about the very different world we're now in. We're seeing impacts of climate. There's a thing in the Financial Times today saying that Freycinet, who make Carver, are having to furlough most of their workforce because of the drought in Spain. We've got farmers on the farming program complaining every day that they either can't plant or they can't harvest their winter crops, or they can't plant spring crops because it's so wet after this winter. We've got geopolitical tensions affecting Ukraine, right, left and center. I mean, you know, does the government need a completely different view of food security, and how can we equip farming to be more resilient to climate change threats, but also play its part in the move to net zero. Minette, do you want to kick off on that?
Yeah, Jill, I think resilience is the absolutely key word. And I guess what's amazed me, my time at the NFU, I was a sort of decade at the NFU. You don't have to look back very far, and you would remember well the time when Sir John Beddington was the government chief scientist. And I remember John in 2009 predicting the perfect storm: climate change, water security, these extreme weather events colliding with the geopolitical situation. And, you know, he was predicting then the mass migration of people fleeing conflict, fleeing areas where producing food was becoming more and more difficult, with the situation with water being absolutely critical in all of this. And John must feel very chuffed right now, because he was absolutely right in everything that he was saying. And the world actually then was really coming together. You had things like the Foresight Report. You had the Balkan work on sustainable intensification. How do we produce more food on less land? And had Europe, and obviously us as members of the European Union, had we all come together then and said, right, we must plan for the future with these big challenges we're facing into. Nobody was predicting a war in Europe then. But had we done that, we would have been in a much, much better place now. Now, the frightening thing is that DEFRA has no intellectual memory of that work. And yet that was only the last financial crash, 2009. And what happened after the financial crash was the markets took off and everybody said, well, producing food, we're a wealthy nation, we can import it. And that's been the line for the UK, and to a certain extent for the European Union. We're wealthy, we can import it. And that's now not looking like a very safe place to be at all. And much as defence, energy, and I would say food security, we need a radical rethink as to how we are going to feed ourselves and how we're going to take less pressure off the world. The pressure that's been put on Spain at the moment with producing everybody's salads is enormous and unsustainable. Here we are with the maritime climate, underwater, too much in some places, not enough in others, ability to store it. We can do it, but it really needs hearts and minds changing for the long term. These parliamentary cycles are so dangerous, whereby once it's okay, we move on again. And I think the last 2 decades shows us that is irresponsible in the extreme.
So should we actually have a view, and this is I think almost top ranked question, should we have a view on the amount of locally grown food that we ought to bank on, as or does that actually just make us vulnerable to things like a very wet winter if we're depending on an awful lot of UK grown food?
I mean, you have to start. I absolutely agree with more locally grown, but you have to start with a bigger picture of, does UK food self-sufficiency matter? And at the moment, we have legislated targets on trees, on clean air, clean water, net zero, house building targets. We have no target on food. So we've been broadly self-sufficient in 60% of food that we produce here, indigenous production, sort of rising up to 75% in some areas. And yet we have no target for food at all. Rishi Sunak has introduced the annual reporting. I mean, honestly, this journey has been so torrid. I mean, to start off with, in 2020, before the agricultural bill achieved royal assent, they wanted to report every 5 years on our self-sufficiency. Well, you could have lost an entire sector in 5 years, you know, with the cost of production impacts of the immediate effect of the war in Ukraine. We saw 1 billion less eggs packed in 22 compared to 2019. So when you're feeding 70 million people, of course you have to have a target, you have to plan for it, you have to have a policy landscape that is helping that sector achieve what's needed. You know, only 2 out of every 5 apples sold in this country in retail are British. And that seems an irony when, you know, we are expert apple growers, we have the climate, But all of these things need a plan, and there's been no plan, and therein lies the problem. So we must, I think, set a target for the food that we're going to be producing here. We should be ambitious about it. And the people really want to see it. All my conversations with retailers, everybody that they were talking to, all their surveying showed that people wanted to be able to buy more local. They wanted to be able to buy British. They valued food miles. They valued seasonality. We're never going to be producing citrus fruits here at scale, but we should be taking food much more seriously than we do. Otherwise, we will face further rationing.
Carmen, do you agree?
Yeah, I suppose you saw my face. Yes and no, probably. I will start with the change of mind. Of the mindsets, absolutely. I always said that, but this is valid for not only for the government, because it seems like that's what, Minette, you're going, it is the government who should do. No, it's all of us which should do. All of us should think about where our food is coming from, what relation we have, what's the relation with nature, how we engage. We lost a lot of things, we lost moral, we lost values, lots of loss. So for me will be, let's start thinking all how we can all work together, so we can all, be in balance with the nature, if this is what the objective is. Target on food. I have to say that really sounds to me subsidies for farmers. I might be absolutely wrong. I might be absolutely wrong, but I do not think that it's about targeting food. I do support local food, and you were right, Minette, talking about our rates of self-sufficiency. That's right, but as you said, we will never be able to produce everything in this country, and this is why we have this trade deals. From my own research and from my own knowledge, so far the UK has not been at a food risk. And we saw that some impact. The impact was a bit clearer during the COVID-19, when we have the lockdown and the supply chain suffer, because indeed the UK food system is a just-in-time system, food system. So we do need to be careful. I do support the idea of all local food supply, but if you think in terms of trade with the impact on the environment, just producing a kilogram of beef in the UK will have the same impact on the environment as producing in any other country. Okay, people will argue we can reduce the carbon footprint through transportation. Transport doesn't really contribute a lot, and most of the food is brought actually by boat. So I think probably yes, I have different views. I do think that farmers are very resilient in these countries. I believe in the British farmers. I also believe in technology. I believe in innovation, and we can see that all the myths about that, we cannot feed the population of 8-9 million is just a myth. We produce sufficient food in this world to feed everybody and beyond, probably. It's just the way we distribute our food and the way we are, and our relationship between countries, and all the time this tension, what we produce is better than the others. I'm sure that if we have this discussion in Romania or in Ireland, they will say the same thing. They will talk about exactly the same thing as we're talking here now. I will stop.
So, Carmen, when I think it was in the food strategy that Henry Dimbleby produced, commissioned by Michael Gove, and then rather ignored by some of his successors, but there was a suggestion, I think, that we should try to move people to a less meat diet, both for health and for carbon footprint reasons. And the Prime Minister last year made a great song and dance of ruling out a meat tax. But should we be prepared to look at government interventions to change what we eat, to maybe use land better, given all the competing demands on land, because livestock farming is quite extensive?
Again, it's our government. Probably is me, coming from a communist country who doesn't want the government to intervene in anything. I don't want a government to nudge me. We do need to eat less meat. I eat less meat. I eat less meat because that's how I've been born. And you know, now, for example, most of the people in Orthodox countries, they are not eating meat because we are fasting for Lent, and we are actually vegan. Some of us are not eating even dairy products, and probably we have a lot of other examples in this world. And I know that in this country we didn't used to eat meat every day. And probably that's what I said. We all need to change our mindset. And I am for a combination and a balance of everything, including, you know, eating less meat.
Okay. Alan, how's this debate looking about food security and resilience of the food system in the EU?
Well, certainly there is a debate. My own personal view, Jill, on this is that it has taken a little bit of a wrong turn. I guess one important difference between the UK and the EU as a whole is that the UK has traditionally always been heavily dependent on imports for its a large share of its food supply, whereas the EU is, it's the world's largest exporter of agri-food products. Now, many of those are these, they're wines, spirits, drinks, essential oils, and so on. But even in the commodities, we are a net exporter of most of the basic commodities. The big gap is, well, one is rice, of course, but the other is animal feed protein, so soybeans and oilseeds, essentially, where we are heavily dependent on imports. But there's a question: is that really a food security issue? And you raise it in terms of should we continue to eat as much animal protein as we do at the moment? It's certainly well beyond what our nutritional requirements are, and whether there's a health disadvantage, I leave to the nutritionists, but certainly there are these environmental costs. There's no doubt that because we are able to import large amounts of animal feed proteins, we have much greater livestock numbers in Europe, and that gives us, in some countries, hotspots of manure overload on land, nitrogen runoff, and very poor quality water. Very few EU member states are going to meet the requirements of healthy waters by 2027. And, agricultural runoff is not the only reason for that, but it is a major contributor. So yes, we do need to look at the livestock sector. That has been a no-go area, in my view, within the European Union. So in the Farm to Fork strategy that I mentioned earlier, published in 2020, yes, you will read that there should be encouragement given to plant-based diets, but there is no discussion of, what is the right size for the livestock sector. And we do clearly need livestock to maintain, for example, our natural grasslands, which are a really important source of biodiversity. But whether we need the intensive livestock to the extent that we have it in Europe, but nobody wants to go there. And so there is, it's a bit like what Minette has talked about in the UK case. There's really a lack of a strategy, and that I think is one reason why farmers are worried, because they don't actually have a clear pathway as to what the future may hold for them.
And as various people are pointing out on in the questions, there is a sort of politicization with the cooptation of some of these farmer concerns by various sort of parties, populist parties across Europe. So final 2 minutes. Very quick answer, just one from each of you, is elections in the EU, European Parliament in June, election in the UK, maybe June, maybe September, October, maybe November, December, January, but sometime within the next year. What would be the sort of one change you would like to see from an incoming government of any persuasion or from a new commission? Alan, what do you think should be the sort of, one thing that a new commission should do?
Well, I think for me, the answer is very simple on this one, Jill. the overriding challenge for our generation is climate change. And at the moment, we simply have not got agriculture and farmers on board in the transition to a net zero. I'm not saying that we will ever get to net zero in agriculture. That's not simply going to be the case, but we need much more active intervention to reduce agricultural emissions in the next mandate in the European Union.
Okay, Carmen, one thing quickly.
Clarity in the direction of what do we want from our farmers.
Karen, brilliant. Minette, last word.
Well, I would agree with Carmen on that, but in order to do that, we have to have a plan, and the government has to have a plan. And this is a time of legislation. The UK has changed more legislation in the last 5 years. Don't forget the last Agricultural Act prior to 2020 was 1947. And that was on the back of 2 world wars, and we were 30% self-sufficient, and we'd faced rationing. So we absolutely must have a plan. The government must, because all of us have to perform to the legislated targets and the regulation that is driven by that legislation. So if they don't have a plan for producing food here, we will just be producing less. And it doesn't need to, we don't need to start again. I talked about the work of Sir John Beddington and the Balkan work. We can do this, but I completely concur with what Alan has said. I think the Green Deal and Farm to Fork are looking very, very behind the curve with taking 25% of land mass out to become organic. We've got to be focusing on sustainability, and that is farming with less inputs, with less cost for farmers, but producing the same amount or more food on the back of it. Now, that needs one hell of a plan, and it also needs global buy-in, because otherwise we will become this bubble whereby, we are doing one thing and the rest of the world is doing another. So we've got to take people with us on this journey. And I think climate change is the challenge of our time. And we really do need to focus on how we produce our food sustainably. We're up for doing that, I think, in the UK as farmers, but we have to have that plan to deliver on it.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. That was a very good place to end. We need a plan. UK needs a plan, EU needs a plan. Maybe those plans go in similar directions, and that would probably make life much easier for everybody. Thank you very much for all your fantastic questions. I'm sorry to anyone whose question I didn't get to, just sort of moving around and trying to merge them in. But thank you in particular to my panelists, Carmen Hubbard, Alan Matthews, and Minette Batters, taking time out of her farm now. Just 2 UK and Changing Europe announcements, apart from read our Brexit and the State report. Tomorrow you can sign up to listen to John Curtis Unlocked. You can't come in person because he's sold out. But you can sign up and watch online. And this time next week, we have a lunch hour on the UK-India relationship. And Anand will not just talk about the last test series, even though he did go and watch India win. So he could be quite annoying, but do sign up and watch that. So thanks to everybody, and see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.